glad I'm here this morning. It's about the first week at school. I was telling some ladies just a minute ago, when you go in and you get to leave and you have 150 kids, and after you get done, everybody comes out with their fingers and toes. It's a good year. It's a good week in the shop, no matter what else happened. So that was positive. Um, One of the things that we did do is I gave them a pretty simple assignment to go through. At least I thought it would be simple. Go through and take a 2x4 or 1x, just a piece of scrap that we had, and they had to cut a 2-inch strip. Didn't matter if they did a rip cut or a cross cut, across the wood or down the length, but I had to have 2 inches. I thought, hey, that's going to take probably 15, 20 minutes. Well, to the T, in 8 classes, it took about 47, 50 minutes to get to a point where everybody did that. And then we went back, and then I really blew their minds. I said, hey, look, this saw will actually go from vertical. We'll turn it, and we'll put it on a bevel, and we'll cut it this way. Now cut a trapezoid in the bottom where you got 3 inches on the bottom of your trapezoid. Whoo! We talk about, hey, we need to go back and do some geometry. So if anybody's a geometry teacher, if you just want to spend some time helping with measurement, y'all are welcome to come to Harbor High School, because that's what I'm going to be doing this week outside. So kind of going back, and one of the things we're going to talk about today is that, there was an image that I had in my mind about what I wanted the students to do. Then there was a gap between their understanding of what to do, that whole idea of what the tools need to be used and how they need to be final product. So we're going to talk about that kind of in a situation this morning when we get into Acts chapter 18. But before we do, I want to go through here. Had some people that were added to the prayer list. Mark and Jan Taylor. Michelle Blue, a friend of Michael Moats. Ed Land. Nyla Royer, his granddaughter Mary Jane Jennings. And then Radine Seitz. And Floyd Whitehead, the father of Keith Whitehead, just his general health idea. Is there anybody that's not on the list that we need to mention before we continue this morning? Yes, sir. Melina? Melina just going through and having some back issues. Just what obviously most of all of you know, when those muscles don't work, it makes everything else really hard to get along with. So. Aaron Woodard is his name. What's her name? Susan. Susan Woodard, a friend of the Hinkles, has found out that she has breast cancer. I'm assuming that they have young kids or young kids at home. Yeah. One in college and one at home. Janie Todd is having some cognitive issues, and they're beginning to become pretty serious, so make sure you keep her in your prayers. I missed somebody in the back. Uh-huh. Did I get right? That, and make sure that we get the right arm or the correct spot. Paperwork, yes. So just Hunter Kilpatrick's going through some more scans. Number one, to make sure that they get the right area, and number two, to make sure that they come back as negative. So, anybody else? Okay. Heavenly Father, we come before you this morning just thankful for the time that we can spend together. Lord, we just ask that we take some of the message that's presented in your word, and we can apply it to our lives. And we ask that we be able to help those that are around us, and we ask that you watch over us and guide us through this week. We just, again, pray a special prayer for those that we mentioned. We just ask that your healing hand be on them and then those that are around them, and then give them peace of mind throughout all the processes that they're facing. Lord, we love you and thank you for your son, Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen. So we're going to be in Acts chapter 18. So if you want to turn there in your Bible or get there on a phone, however you want to do that. What was really kind of unique about this week at school also is we didn't give kids any technology. They could have their phones, but they didn't get a Chromebook. So it was our administration and leadership at schools is, how do you build relationships with students? So we had 5 days of nothing but building relationships. So it's kind of unique because I've never done that before, especially being an AP physics teacher. What do? Here's your book. Here's 5 chapters of homework to get done. I want to cull the wheat from the tares in a hurry, right? But this is one of the first times in 28 years now that I could go through, and we actually spent time getting to know each other, which is kind of nice. The technology part's coming, so, how do you catch up in a week? It won't be that big a deal. There's some overlap with that and how you see Paul, I believe, what did he do and what happens with the relationships that occur and grow when he gets to Corinth. And again, if you go through, we started out in the early part of Acts and we went from Philippi. Again, we're talking about Macedonia, the top portion. Second missionary journey, we went from Philippi to Thessalonica, then to Berea, and then Athens. And we're coming out of Athens and we're going to Corinth this week. In each one of those cities, basically you had a pattern where Paul goes into a synagogue, he preaches, those who are receptive, he starts this process of telling them and explaining about who Christ is and who the Messiah was. And there's a growth. There's at least a little bit of commonality that goes in each one of those places, and then there's enough change in that city that it causes a problem for some of the people that are there, and now he's run out of town. And so this has happened to him, and as he's run out of Athens, this happens the 4th time. And as we go to Corinth, you got to think about what was early Corinth like. Well, Corinth, when Paul was there, and we have pretty good, and then we're going to talk about the historical facts about this in just a little bit, but we have pretty good dating on when Paul was there because one of the characters we're going to talk about, Gallio, was actually a brother of Seneca who was the tutor of Nero, and they are all in the imperial Roman records. All these men and all their accomplishments, the things that they did, what they did for their cities, it's all available, and there's no speculation about what season. In fact, you can actually know that Paul is probably there in the spring of AD 50, and he stays till about the fall of 52. So as we go through this, what was Corinth about? Corinth was probably, most likely, if you had Athens was a university town, you could describe Corinth as the Las Vegas. Corinth was the town that was on the isthmus, and that isthmus area connected the Pan of Greece to the actually mainland, and there was a narrow corridor that was used to transfer ships. And actually, the Romans came back in and they built roads across so that small ships could actually be ferried across loaded. They would load the ships on wood, either on wooden carts later on, but firstly probably just on logs, and they would roll them across from one seaport to the other, so that you didn't have to, as a sailor, go 200 miles out of your way to get to a different area. The other thing that's important about this is that in the time of, as a city, Corinth was destroyed in about 44 BC. And Julius Caesar kind of comes back, or actually before then it was destroyed, and he kind of comes back and rebuilds that as a travel way. One of the things they start doing is they start digging basically the Corinth Canal. And the Corinth Canal could be analogous to what happened in Panama, where you go through and you take a small piece of land, you connect 2 oceans. Well, this is actually going through and connecting 2 seas. And it was completed in 1858 Took a long time to dig through the rock, apparently, or, we didn't have government funding to do that in certain areas. But you now had this isthmus that was crossed by water and by land. So Corinth was a seaport, was also an area where you went through and you could find, obviously, any type of venture that you wanted to get into. Again, I don't know that I'm too far off with saying if you go through and read different comments or what happened in ancient Corinth, slavery was a large, I don't know how you say that. Slavery was a large business at that time that was in Corinth, so you had slaves that were moved across. It was also one of those places that connected east to west in the movement and transport of materials to Rome. So you had all these places, all these cultures come together in Corinth. Aside from just a little bit of background about Corinth, we're going to get introduced to two people, a husband and a wife team in chapter 18. We're also going to get introduced to a man named Apollos. So we got Priscilla and Aquila and Apollos. And I want to start out just by reading the first 4 verses of chapter 18. So after these things is referring to basically what had happened to him in Athens. He left Athens and went to Corinth. And if you remember what happened to him in Athens, he'd gone and he'd preached. He'd gone to Mars Hill. He'd gone and had dialogue with the learned and the connected people there. And then basically, in the end, he leaves. He just says, it's time to go. I've said what I'm going to say. And he leaves Athens and starts to head to Corinth. Verse 2, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, and having received or recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by the trade they were tent makers, and he was reasoning in the synagogues every Sabbath and trying to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. So comes to Corinth. He finds Aquila and Priscilla. And why are they in Corinth? Yes, sir.
Well, they were Jews who were forced out of Rome because of the edict of Claudius.
So you have at this time the Roman government, from documentation, saw Christianity as a sect of Judaism. And basically, the way the Roman governors were to treat it was, if they're causing problems, we're going to move them to a different spot. So they moved all these people. I told them, you can't stay in Rome anymore. You Jews are causing all this trouble. You can't be here anymore. Same thing is happening in a lot of areas that we see in Paul's journeys, but also all the areas around Jerusalem where Jesus was there teaching and preaching. Yes, sir. Christus, right?
And so we see this is one of the very first mentions of the power and the influence that was coming, that Christianity had arrived in Rome, and enough was going on that the Jews were actually up in arms about it.
So Christianity is causing enough problems for the Jews, and basically what he's saying is that as you go through, the Romans were trying to quench all the fire. So hey, we want peace. We don't want problems with a different group. Now, this is important for this story because when Paul eventually goes in front of an administrator in just a little bit, the Jews do an end round. They had been going in every one of these other cities. They had always taken Paul to the city council. But in Corinth, they don't take him to the city council. They take him directly to the highest Roman official, basically for the area. So we talked about these things. Priscilla and Aquila, I don't guess it's really speculation, but being a tent maker at this time was one of the ways that you actually produced lodging for people. Being a tent maker also meant that you did other types of leather work. So they may have been, this is speculation, may have been doing saddles, purses. They could have gone through and made, some type of luggage holders, straps for different types of doorways, all different kinds of things, but they were in the leather trades. So as you go through here, excuse me, in verse 5, we'll get to this point here. I want to go through and read 5 through 11, and there's a couple of things that I want to make sure that we get as we go through this. Number one, after Paul has gone through and he was by himself in Athens, now he's getting a team together. I mean, there's a difference. He was in Athens by himself. He was preaching in these areas at Mars Hill, and now in Corinth, he's going to have a group of people that are with him. And in verse 5, we get 2 of his old friends are back with him. In verse 5, but when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But then they resisted and blasphemed. He shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads, I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." And he left there and he went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was next to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, when they heard, they were believing and being baptized. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city." And when he settled there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So, a couple of things that we want to make sure that we're good with. What had Paul, or what had God done for Paul during this idea? He put these relationships back in his life. Number one, he meets a husband and wife team that he's going to go through and develop a relationship with. He's also going to get Timothy and Silas are going to come back into the picture to help him out. And it's important when Timothy and Silas show up, they are bringing enough gifts with them that have been donated by the other churches that Paul no longer has to work as a tent maker. Okay, he didn't have to do that work. Now, we don't really know, we don't get an example if Priscilla and Aquila were able to do that or not, but we know that Paul didn't have to do that. In this instance, we go through and we also see that God gave him a work. What was the work that Paul was supposed to do, the physical work that he was doing before Silas and Timothy show up? So he had Priscilla and Aquila, he's staying with them, and what are they all doing? They're making tents. They're going through so that he had people around him, he had a physical labor for him to do, and then he had an opportunity to share the gospel. And he starts sharing the gospel. If you look in verse 5, he goes back and it's the same pattern. We're going to start out in the synagogue, and we're going to go through with those who are already knowing about the old covenant, and we're going to start out our process with them. Just like in Philippi, Thessalonica, other places, here in Corinth, he doesn't get the reaction that he really wants, and he has to start a different idea or a different group. Yes, sir.
So before you leave the tent making totally, it's part of, I think, the genius of the Jewish educational system. Everyone, they wanted their sons, if they could, become a rabbi or a teacher of the law because that was the highest calling.
Highest esteem, right.
But they were practical enough to say, you also need something that if you can't be a rabbi, if you're someplace you lose your job or you can't get there, you need something to survive on. And so every person, like Paul, here's Paul, who was a highly educated man, a doctor of the law, all of this, but he was also trained to be a tent maker.
Right.
So that when he needed to, he could support himself until he found jobs elsewhere. So there's, I think, a great insight there that we can learn from the Jews. That sometimes, yes, it's great to have the high education, but sometimes it's also nice to have something to fall back on.
Right, and that something to fall back on is something I dealt with all week. Was just when you're getting to know your kids, what are you trying to show them? I mean, education, honestly, is nothing but opportunity. Can you open a door, find a way to go through and have an opportunity to do something different that you're interested in later on? And it's really no different than the idea that you were talking about the Jews and how they set up their educational system. Yeah, we want to push you this way, but we want to make sure that you have something. exceptions to the rule or venues that you can actually float on. And again, here you have a husband and wife team, and you have Paul that are going through, and they're going to make a living to support their work spreading the gospel. Their goal is to spread the gospel, and eventually they're going to get enough. Again, Paul's never one that goes through and asks for a lot of things, but they are brought to him so that he can actually go through and forward the gospel. Anything else about any of those ideas? No? Y'all are quiet? It is. It's like the fourth Sunday in the row of me being up here, so y'all are going back into survival mode. I get it. When you go through, you see Silas and Timothy. Tell me about this Titus gentleman in verse 7. What do we know about Titus? Yeah, so his house is right next to the synagogue, and basically Paul has gone in and said, "Hey, I'm leaving the synagogue. I'm not going to come here anymore, but I'm going to go next door." Right? And then we have this other person, this Crispus. What's important about knowing who Crispus was? What was his title?
They said he was a leader.
He was a leader of the synagogue, and usually, and we don't know this. I mean, it's not 100% on point in what goes on with the Bible, or what's written in the Bible, because Luke doesn't tell us. But Crispus was probably one of the two leaders of the synagogue, and then you had Crispus, who was in this position. He leaves, somebody takes his place. The guy who was probably there is Sosthenes, and we're going to talk about him in just a minute. But Crispus is the leader of the synagogue who hears things, and just like Cornelius, his whole household is converted, right? So now you had somebody who was a religious influence, and his whole family is transitioned. Yes, sir.
It's just dawned on me. It's kind of an unusual thing. Not very many people in the Bible that we read about have two names. He did.
Titus did, right? Titus Justice, and there's, not to get into a big, long treatise on this, but this may or may not have been the Titus that is written to, probably not, because his justice is not mentioned later on. But Titus and then Sosthenes are names that are, like David and Paul, Ted. I mean, they're not uncommon names, so there are probably several of those. But the idea is that here you had people who were in the synagogue, and although Paul goes and he cleans off his feet, knocks the dust off his clothes at the synagogue, there's enough people around him who have heard that he's got an opportunity. And his opportunity is right next door to the synagogue. So people who were followers of God, they were God-fearers, they knew where to go. Not only that, now you have Crispus, who was a leader in the synagogue. His entire family, as a Jewish religious leader in Corinth, his entire family is converted. So that ends up being a big, political and religious ideal for what's going on. In verse 18, in Acts 18, verses 9 and 10. I want to go through and break this down. So Paul's got his team together, right? So you have Silas and Timothy, you have Priscilla and Aquila, now you have Crispus and Titus. So he's got places to go, people to see, and he's got leaders that he can go through and depend on to help him in his work. But one of the things that's very unique is that this is not the first time, it's the second time actually in Acts where we see Paul being visited by Jesus in a vision. And basically, do not be afraid any longer. If you have those words together, there's 6 words there. Do not be afraid any longer. What does that actually mean about your past? You're afraid. You got stuff going on, you've been afraid. What's he been afraid of? If you go back through the things that we've talked about the last several weeks, you start out in Philippi. You go through, you start a church, things get good. Now we get opposition. Now I get beat and run out of town. I go to Thessalonica. I start out. Start out in the synagogue, start out with a group of people. Things are good. The church starts to grow. Now what? I get opposition from the town leaders, and I get run out of town. And again, Corinth is the fourth city that we're talking about where, do not be afraid any longer. Paul's a man, and I believe that after you've gone through and you see this pattern coming over and over again, you see a growth in a church in the area, and then you see opposition, and then you get run out of town, he's probably thinking what's going to happen to him in Corinth. I'm just guessing, but it's probably going to think the same thing, right? You go into a town that's like Las Vegas in the ancient world, that's you're going to find some opposition. So he goes through and, he's being admonished. And he's being admonished by Jesus, right? And I think it's very important that we keep that in perspective, that this is Jesus talking to him. But what does Jesus ask him to do? So his past, he says, don't be afraid any longer. What is he supposed to do in the present? To keep teaching, to go on speaking. Don't be silent. Don't be afraid. There's no point in being afraid. That's in the past. Your job right now is to go and speak and do not be silent. And what's he telling him about his future? What's Jesus telling him about his future? I mean, Jesus promises it to him, right? No man will attack you or harm you, for I have what? Many people in the city. And the many people that, Paul doesn't understand or would not have understood was how many people are there around him to protect what's about to happen. So again, in this idea at Corinth, you've got Paul that goes to Corinth to get started. He's meets Priscilla and Aquila. He has Timothy and Silas show up and help him. And then he has a venue to preach his message, which is right next door to the synagogue, that he can always go to. The second thing is he just named a Jewish synagogue leader that everybody in the town knew, not just the Jews, but probably most of the people who are in the religious different sects around the town. And now this person in his household has been converted. So everything's setting the stage to make a really different change in what's happened in Athens. Because if you'd gone through and read what happened in Athens, you're talking about different soils. As a preview, you would think if nothing happened in Athens, now I'm going to Corinth, and Corinth is worse than Athens. I probably don't have much of a chance, but what we see is that message is actually transmitted pretty readily. And I didn't know, I was talking to Joe last week, something about this, and what you see in Acts 9, 1 through 6, Acts 22, 17, 18, Acts 23, 11, Acts 27, 23, 25, and 2 Timothy 4, 16, and 17, those are all places where Paul is visited by Christ. And one of the things that I never really thought about was how many times in Acts, again, because I just going through and starting out earlier, I would read through, hey, you went to this city, started a church, and you went somewhere else, right? How many times did Jesus come back to Paul and say, things are going to be okay, I've got people here for you, I know that there's stuff that has happened to you in the past, but I don't need you to be afraid. So this same message, this past, present, future message that he gets in verses 9 and 10 shows back up 5 other times. Yes, sir.
I think the statement, for I have many people in this city, as you were saying, Corinth was rather a rough town.
Mm-hmm.
But God said, look, there are people out there that you can touch. And it always brings to mind to me back in the Old Testament, back in Kings, right here, 1 Kings 15 and 18, where Elijah, remember, was fleeing from Jezebel.
Right.
And he goes into the mountain, and he's sitting there, and he's telling God all around me, she's after me, and I'm all alone, and all this has happened to me, and I feel so bad. And God says, stop your moaning. Get up and go do this, because he says, yet will I leave 7,000 in Israel, all the needs that
Right.
Don't worry about it. You've got people out there.
There'll be enough. Right.
Just go find them.
And I think one of the messages that really comes out of Acts 18 is that, just in general, is that when you go through, God may be putting people in your life that you need, that you're turning away because you think you need to do something. And that opportunity is something that is, just out of my life, there's besides my family members, I've had a relationship with some of my coaches forever. I mean, I still go fishing with one of them all the time. We go bird hunting together. I would have never thought, being in high school, that this guy would be somebody that I would spend a week in South Dakota bird hunting with, or I would spend 2 or 3 Saturdays a summer fishing out of his boat. I mean, I thought, I'm getting as far away from that guy as I can. But he's gone through, and as a mentor, and has shown me things in his life, things that he did right, and he's been real honest about things that he completely screwed up. And I think that when we don't allow those things to happen naturally, sometimes you might push people away that can help you, that you don't even really know that you need. God's put them there, but you don't know that you need to get out of that situation that you're in, right? As a biology teacher, one of my favorite stories was, you take a toad, you set them in the water, and if it's hot water or boiling water, the toad will jump out. You take that toad, you set it in the water, and you turn off the water while the toad's in it. They don't know that they're in boiling water until it's too late. So the whole idea is, do you see what's going on around you, and can you get help, or can you get information from other people that God has basically put in your life? And right now, again, Jesus is telling him, hey, I'm building you a team here. We've got the right people in place. This is going to be a place where you're going to enjoy your stay. And in verse 11, what does he tell them? I mean, this is the result, really. The result is what? How long does Paul stay in Corinth? 1.5 years. And it's one of the longest places that he actually stayed as he was touring around through his different journeys. If we want to look real quick, we're going to flip to the next section of 18, which is a different context and a different group of people. So you've got his team that's together, and you're going through, and these people have been preaching the word, and now the Jews in town have gotten upset, just like the same pattern that we've gone through. The Jews are upset because we're preaching about this Christ. And here, the Jews, instead of bringing them before the city council, actually take them to the Roman authority in the region. Okay, since Corinth was a port town, had a little bit more access, especially since Corinth was one of the last places where there was a large transition when getting goods across the ocean back and forth to Rome. In verse 12, but while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, "This man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of right or wrong or a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about words and names and your own law, look after it yourselves. I am unwilling to be a judge in these matters." And he drove them away from the judgment seat. And they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. But Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. So they had been preaching for a time. There had been a growth that was going on. Again, Gallio was a brother of Seneca, who was a tutor of Nero, and we'll talk more about that towards the end of Acts. And then Gallio is mentioned by imperial writers from July 51 dates, so that you know that we know that Paul's there, and we know what time he's there. We know the things that are actually going on, and I believe there's actually some records of actual, loads of different shipments that are brought through from 51 to 52. So, in this situation, we're going to go through and we're going to find this leader. And with his background and ties to Roman government, one of the things that we want to make sure that we pay attention to is that Number one, if you're a fan of Paul, okay, you're a fan of justice. Gallio is basically one of the first recorded times outside of Roman documentaries about what happened after the 2nd century that we have this freedom of religion idea. Okay, and the Romans were, they wanted people to be not a problem, I guess is the best way to put it. So as you go through, Gallio says to them, if it were a matter of your actual crime or a problem that you would have had in Roman law, we would look into it, but this is a Jewish problem, so you go and take care of it. Now, what did the Jews do after he had said that? You remember one of their leaders of the synagogue had been converted to Christianity. What did the other one do? He had helped bring these people before Gallio, and now what do the Jews, what do the group of Jews that are with Sosthenes do to Sosthenes? They beat him up. I mean, there's a couple of things that go along with this, and again, this is more speculation and based on what happened in Corinth with Christianity after this date. There was a time and period, so you had Gallio, who was a province administrator. And if he ruled on something of this weight, of this magnitude, there was a record of it, and that was scattered out among the other provinces so that everybody in the Roman government would make the same types of rulings. So there's a gap, and one of the commentaries that I'm working out of, so there was a gap of about 8 to 10 years where there was more a peaceful look on Christianity than in other places. And it started because of what Gallio had done in this particular province. He didn't want to mess with the Jews and their problems, so he basically said, you take care of it yourselves. How do they take care of it? We don't know who the actual they are. It could have been they Jews, or it could have been they. Remember we talked about the Agrippa, the other people who were always around. They could have been the ones that got a hold of Sosthenes. But Sosthenes, the name Sosthenes, actually comes up again in the New Testament. Just as a trivia question, anybody know where Sosthenes? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
And protest against that, just like they did here.
Right.
So it's not just what's going on in our world today.
It's just a repeated process, and again, we're on our 5th city, right? And you're going to see this as you go through Acts. You're going to see it continue basically through every place that it goes. And we're going to talk about Ephesus a little bit later today. How you get a transition and how people see their rights. And basically, us seeing our right for our own benefit is it's a shadow from evil, basically. Because we need to give up our rights to help others. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more next week. But you're 100% correct in the fact that you go through and you see all of this stuff happens today. Whatever you think is new is really old. It's just a rinse and repeat. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry. I thought you were talking to. Anything else about this incident? I did ask a question about Sosthenes. Sosthenes comes up later on, and we don't know if it's the same one. Again, Sosthenes, Titus, those are really common names, but there is a Sosthenes that's referenced later, and he actually ends up being a leader in Corinth. And we don't know if this is the same person or not. But there is some speculation that it was. So if we're going to move on, let's move on to Acts 18 through 22. And so Paul is about to leave Corinth after he got this ruling with Gallio. And Paul, again, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria. And with him were Priscilla and Aquila. In Caesarea, he had cut his hair, for he was keeping a vow. And they came to Ephesus, and he left them there. Now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And when he asked him to stay for a long time, he did not consent, but taking leave of them and saying, I will return to you again if God wills it. Then he set sail from Ephesus. And when he landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and went down to Antioch. So now Luke has gone through this process. After in Corinth, he got an agreement with basically the Roman government, said, hey, this doesn't affect us. You need to go through and take care of this yourselves. Now Paul's going to leave after some time, and his travel companions again are Priscilla and Aquila. Why would you take Priscilla and Aquila with you if you're Paul? Number one, they wanted to go. Probably number two, they were all in the same trade so they could live and work together. So he had found some friendship that's there. One of the most unique things is if you go through and you think about what happened in the New Testament, Priscilla and Aquila are the first examples of a marriage that actually works, right? We had an example before then, or earlier in Acts, about two people that the marriage wasn't in good shape, right? Anybody remember who those folks were? Ananias and Sapphira, right? Okay. Anybody, you go through, and Priscilla and Aquila are the first ones in the New Testament that really go through, and you see them support the growth of the church. What about this vow? I know I'm running out of time, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but anybody done vows? I've done vows. Dear God, please let this guy catch this ball on 4th and 18 so we can have a chance to go on. What will I do? I don't know what I'll do. I'll try not to, get upset if we don't, or I'll try not to do this. Maybe it's more important. Maybe you've had a situation where somebody in your family's been sick, other things are going on, but a vow, especially a Nazirite vow, was basically two things to a Jew. Number one, it was a give and take. So I'm going to do something, but I expect back something from you, God. And with that, there were a couple of things that you had to do. You had to stay away from grapes. There wasn't any wine. There wasn't any raisins. They didn't have Raisinets then. I don't know. They may have. I don't know if they had chocolate. Yeah, probably. You go through and you had to do something with your hair. Anybody remember about the vows from Numbers? You couldn't cut your hair, and when the vow was fulfilled, you cut your hair, then you had to go take your hair and leave it at this as an offering, right? Okay. Real quick, I think we got time for this. We're going to look at Numbers 6, Numbers chapter 6, verse 1, because this is going to kind of lay a foundation for what we're going to talk about next week. And I'm reading out of the NIV in this situation. So Numbers chapter 6, verse 1. And the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man or woman wants to make a special vow, a vow of dedication to the Lord as a Nazirite, they must abstain from wine and other fermented drink, and must not drink vinegar made from wine or other fermented drink. They must not drink grape juice or eat grapes or raisins. As long as they remain under the Nazirite vow, they must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, not even the seeds or skins. During the entire period of their Nazirite vow, no razor may be used on their head. They must be holy until the period of the dedication to the Lord is over. They must let their hair grow long. Throughout the period of dedication to the Lord, the Nazirite must not go near a dead body. Even if it's their own father or mother or brother or sister dies, they must not make themselves ceremonially unclean on account of them, because the symbol of the dedication to the God is on their head. Throughout the period of the dedication, they are considered sacred to the Lord. So you had to stay away from dead bodies. So however long you've gone through and whatever your gap of time was between I'm going to do this and God's going to do this for me, you had to stay away from dead bodies. You couldn't eat grapes. You couldn't eat anything from a grape. And we'll talk about that a little bit more next week. So in Acts 18, what I need you to do is on the vow idea. Again, we're Numbers 6, 1 through 7. If you don't mind, before next week, try to think about a situation in your life where you may have played one of those vow games with God. I need you to do this for me, God, I'll do this. And we want to, in the context of what we're going to do in class next week, we want to frame that. You're not going to have to share it. I'm not going to give you a piece of paper. We're not going to read them out loud, post your name and picture by it. All I want you to do is think about that vow that you might have made at some point, and we're going to frame next week's lesson around that. So thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next week.